Hello. Thank you so much for the beautiful introduction. So my name's Astrida, and my talk today is called Holdfast, Learning Feeling. Before beginning, I just want to acknowledge that this talk was mostly researched and written on the unceded territories of the Syilx people, and also on the Duwamish lands in Seattle. And before I begin with the talk proper, which I think is actually more like a long poem, I thought I'd better give you a bit of context and describe some of the components of the research that I am drawing into connection here. So this talk draws on a few different projects that I've been working on for a few years. One of them is a mostly philosophical project about extinction and feeling. I think I was a bit tired and puzzled by charges of anthropomorphism within scholarly communities against any attempt to try to understand more than human worlds. So partly this talk is about trying to wrestle with that strange charge, like we can't know what other non-human worlds feel. So I'm interested in language and feeling and how we share it. And that project is also anchored in this strange sort of kelp skin photo auto theory project I've been developing for the last few years. I'm not really sure why I'm so compelled to take these photos, but I'm slowly figuring it out. And probably the most prominent element of this talk references a 3-year-long research project on marine mammal necropsy that I've been working on together with Los Angeles-based artist Patty Chang and wildlife pathologist Astrida Neimanis, who is also my sister. This project has been about many things. It's called Learning Endings. It has a website if you want to go check it out. So Learning Endings is about many things, including death and grief and endings and undersea worlds and how we meet them, and siblings and mothers, and the idea that science might serve as a form of care. This project began 3 years ago when Alexia in Uppsala, Sweden, which is where she lives, invited me and Patty into her lab to watch her work performing necropsies, which are, autopsies on animals that have died in order to try to discern why they died. So Alexia invited us into her lab to watch her do these necropsies, but because this was January, February, March 2021, and COVID, Patty and I watched through the portals of our laptops in Kelowna, BC, and Los Angeles, California, respectively, which was for us in the middle of the night. Trying to keep myself from falling asleep, I would transcribe everything Alexia was narrating as she worked verbatim as much as I could, sometimes also noting what was going on around me. Birds starting to wake up or children coming downstairs in search of breakfast. This observational research led to other things, for example, interviewing a number of prominent marine mammal pathologists about their work with a number of near extinct species. In one case, interviewing someone who had performed a necropsy for an animal that was potentially the last female adult species in the wild, and who actually died during the course of that scientist's research. We also worked we actually researched various kinds of underwater sound, learning both from sound artists and scientists, and researched different aspects of palliative care and death doulaing. And the project has been shown in several venues, including at the Neuberger Gallery in Purchase, New York, as a multimedia installation, and also as a community workshop in Seattle in 2021, or 2022 rather, in collaboration with the Henry Art Gallery. And my talk today, I guess, is another iteration of this project. And before getting into it properly, I also want to just really from my heart acknowledge some of the collaborators who've been part of this work, including Jamie Wang, Sue Reed, Tara Nicholson, Al Jones, Jess Lake Harrington, Samantha Lynn Martinez, and many other scientists and activists who generously gave their time to speak to us or allowed us to observe their work. Jesse Huggins from the Cascadia Research Team in Washington, Will Wilcock from the University of Washington, Ocean Park and Aquatic Animal Lab in Hong Kong under the leadership of Dr. Brian Kott, and the National Veterinary Institute in Sweden, where Alexia, my sister, leads the Marine Mammal Disease Surveillance Program. I also want to acknowledge our collaborator, musician and sound artist, Anne Bourne, as well as Duwamish elder Ken Workman, who spoke to us about another kind of ending and persisting. Also thanks, of course, to the Ho Family Foundation that gave us a grant without making us produce anything initially, which was entirely important to how this work developed, and to the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle, who were amazing collaborators. And so in bringing all of these different strands of research together, I think this talk is about language and feeling and how we touch and are touched by the more than human world. I think I'm trying to figure out how we are supposed to feel when everything is dying, but when some things persist even still. And I think I'm trying to figure out the point of writing. Finally, while this talk is about death, mostly of cetaceans and other marine mammals, I hope it vibrates alongside what needs to be our continued refusal to look away from the deathscapes unfolding in Gaza and elsewhere right now. As said by Deborah Bird-Rose, whom I cite later in this talk, in living with the dying of others, we bear the burden of witness, where the pressing question is how we inhabit the death zone, how we call out, and how we refuse to abandon others. So let's begin. Part 1, sea skin. There are so many ways to die: exposed, elementally displaced kelp, feigns leather, invertebrate life on this stretch of beach. The strength and the sleek of the once slipping up limbs now wilted give in to the weight of the open air. Lie still, hold on. These supple arms once wrapped themselves around otter, almost gone. Necklaces linking hands, giants thwarting, floating away. Sinuous unfurling, furling around, densely furred flack, trying to get some rest. There cradled, now here, on the sand, to hold it between my fingers is touching ghosts. Tonguing a dislocated frond, vegetable tentacle is to put your palm on the back of another beached soul. Porpoise skin, whale cheek, still breathing. This multispecies fellow feeling as elemental, as air, as water. I remember the cold jolt, the breath taking, arrival, everything going under, flashing against thinnest skin. The world is sharper in the dark. Part 2. I do a lot of necropsy by feel. Ocean Vuong, poet of death and beauty and holding and feeling, recalls how at 11 years old, he watched his father lay his cheek to a beached dolphin's wet back, right arm cradling the pinkish snout. Father, heartbroken from a faraway war, quote, kneels to gather the wet refugee into his arms, waves swallowing his legs. I read this before Patty and I start watching you through the webcam. It is COVID and you are in your lab alone, caring for the porpoises that wash up on your stainless steel table. 12th of May, 2021, 3:02 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, which is also 2 minutes past noon in Uppsala, Sweden, in a room at the National Veterinary Institute. You are running your hands smoothly along the skin, moving from the head down the animal. You are feeling for net marks. Bycatch, you say. Female found in the beginning of March, not emaciated, possibly poor condition. No other abnormalities, fingers pressing into flensed side belly. Traffic is waking up. Outside, I can see the faint sparkle of the Big Dipper. 3:46 a.m., scoring the blubber, stacking it up, someone is taking it from the table. Now I'm with you. I'm at the mammary gland. It looks pretty inactive. I tried to express milk, but there was nothing there, you say. There's a little bit of hemorrhage, base of the skull, back of the neck, likely when the animal was caught in the net and struggling. Remove the apexial muscle. Now I'm going to open the abdomen carefully, you say. It's a little girl with immature ovaries, which I'm going to remove. I do a lot of necropsy by feel, you say, removing the tongue, then trachea, just popping out the epiglottis so I can remove the rest. First, I need to wash my hands. My daughter's calling, hello, yeah, yep, jättebra, hey, hey. The lung and the heart underneath it. The uterus, the ovaries, and the bladder underneath. Okay, liver. It's actually really beautiful. Firm texture, color as it should be. The body is open like a mouth. As always, Patty and I are watching through the portals of our laptops. We are hovering in the corner of your screen, which we know is placed on a small trolley that attends you as you attend to this animal, thousands of miles away from us. Because of the time differences, for Patty and me, it's the middle of the night. This rented townhouse I'm in is dark and quiet. As you proceed through your protocols, the birds on the other side of the window are getting louder. Soon the traffic does too, and all of a sudden, sky. At first, Patty and I asked a lot of questions, but now we're mostly silent. I keep myself awake by taking free-form notes, usually 20 or more pages per session. It feels urgent to write down everything. Soon my wrist is aching. It is impossible to hold it all. Any photography or recordings of the necropsy room or of the animal are not permitted. So instead of screenshotting, I watch Patty watching you. Her hair is glossy black, her red eyeglasses a gash across her forehead. Her facial expressions index what is happening on the table. The rhythm of the note-taking absorbs me. Focused on your voice, my head stays down for 2 or 3 minutes. I'm surprised to look back at the screen and find the table mostly empty. The animal components already removed, a blue-gloved hand hosing it down. These animals are so elusive. Your voice is still steady, methodically working your way through your notes. Porpoise, previously frozen, parts of body, female adult, cannot determine body condition, severely autolyzed, sitting in the fridge so long, suspected bycatch, but undetermined. Before you begin each necropsy, Patty asks you to take a photo of yourself with your hand on the animal. You do this by yourself with the animal in the freezer. As the series of necropsies rolls on through the spring, you tell me and Patty about how you have come to welcome this ritual, both part of and in excess of the scientific practice. These photos, hand on back, come to comprise an archive, a touch archive, we begin calling it. Part 3, fellow feeling. In their feeling, other beings become known to us, and feeling is how we become alive to the world. Human bodies learn feeling from the more than human world. Consider the sea otter that spins its body into the giant kelp's grasp so that while sleeping, the otter won't float away. The kelp forest mentors us in tenacity, vegetable pelt anchored to the bottom of the shallow sea with a holdfast. We learn about trust and a tender squeeze. The resting body of the kelp-hugged otter, belly up to sky, teaches us an uncomplicated dependence, how to be held even when we have left the sure tether of the shoreline behind. And the seawater schools us in floating. Our own bodies feel their way into this multispecies sympoiesis. We are the otter being held, or the kelp fingers holding, or maybe we are the vigilant sea. Yet, scholars cannot help but scold each other where imposing such language on these more than human bodies becomes mistaken for a kind of human mastery, always centering the human, so the finger wagging goes. We foist a human feeling language of our own invention onto non-human bodies, whose interiority, presumably, we cannot possibly know. This is a double-sided sort of scholar's paranoia of both feeling and language, of both bodies and poetics. The first side erects a barrier between the feeling of our bodies and the feelings of the world. We writers, we feelers, are chastised for our anthropomorphism, which is also apparently our anthropocentrism. We will not presume to know the feeling of a non-human other. We are made to write on the blackboard 100 times, etching it into our habit. The first side of this scholarly paranoia then insists on the non-permeability of feeling worlds. The second side of this paranoia is a related concern that insists that words we use to describe our own interiorities, trust, joy, love, fear, grief, shame, compassion, have no application beyond our own human experience. To use this language, and in doing so, to again presume that we have access to the inner worlds of non-humans, is denounced as a sort of species superciliousness. Such moves would presume that the world only comes alive according to our terms, and we parse everything through our frames of feeling. The second concern is thus also a claim that language was forged by us alone. Language was not something to uncover or to learn, but rather we made it, we mastered it. Its application beyond ourselves is just an extension of this power. But what if our attribution of feeling to non-human entities using human language were not an extension of human mastery, but a recognition of the very source of our own affections and sensitivities in the world around us? What if this were not some anthropomorphic or anthropocentric arrogance, but rather an elemental, multispecies sort of synesthesia? Words shapeshift and grow a thick layer of blubber around them. I feel the slippery toughness of the kelp with my tongue against the inside of my taut cheek. I sense the kelp breathing with my palm as it rests against your stranded skin, Holdfast tightening around my thumb. I hear the sea snoring through my wrinkled fingertips, salt on my teeth like sparks in the night sky. Am I feeling only what is inside of me, or do I touch the whole ocean? On this view, the sensory experiences of one species or body would find pathways of expression through the feeling organs of others. Part 4, Holdfasting. In May, you show me an old photo you found of yourself from the 1990s in the Bay of Fundy. You were doing porpoise rescues with the Grand Manan Research Station, and you're sitting in a boat. A rescued porpoise quickly brought aboard so that it could be weighed and measured and sampled, and then safely returned to the waters outside of the herring weir nets. Your hand rests on the back of its gray body. In August, I sit outside on my couch, on my porch, and finally open the package of photos Patty sent me in April. My hands touch the photo paper, your hands touching the animals falling through my fingers. Holdfasting describes the relationship between a piece of kelp and its anchor. Neither sessile nor motile, these pelts are anchored in relation to another being, a mussel or a stone held by a lively ocean. We call the root-like structures that hold on for dear life haptera, which relates to the word haptic and is about touch. Holding, touching, learning, and feeling. Part 5, Semi-Permeable Poems. Although we take emotions to be distinctly human phenomena, writes philosopher Alfonso Lingus, not only do emotions discharge their forces on the outside environment, but they have their source in it. In hapticity or touch, we experience the directness of this vector. What is in the world enters us through our semi-permeable skin. In this sense, the sea, the otter, and the kelp not only belie the myth of anthropomorphism, but also the view that feeling is just an internal state, because feeling is found nowhere but in the world. This is not to say that the non-human world is a vending machine of feelings, whereby we could access a feeling like trepidation or giddiness, a deep sense of calm, or even something so factical as the slipperiness of your vegetable skin by simply slotting in a coin and keying in the right combination. No, feelings are no more to be found intact in the world out there than they are uniquely enclosed within some interiority of me. Isn't it more accurate to say that feeling is intersubjective, or even better, intercorporeal? Feeling in this sense is a body's way of becoming more itself in the presence of other bodies, feeling its mode of relating. Fellow feeling is the character of the milieu that a body engenders, or the orientations it encourages. It is an energetic call and response, a tether of connection. Rather than just poetics, the search for adequate language to hold these phenomena is a true story of sensory learning and material relation. In other words, what if the appreciation of a sensate more than human world were not a centering of our own colonizing language, but rather to risk decentering our human selves as we give ourselves over to a humbling awareness of this fellow feeling? To decenter is to enter and be entered. To write a poem is to risk falling apart entirely. It requires that we refuse to see humans as the origin of language and instead admit that we merely participate in the sensuous languages of the world. I neither imagine nor conjure the bereftness of an ocean bed with no forest. I feel the loneliness enter me and nestle somewhere close to my spleen. Even if feelings are how bodies become alive to us, this does not splay the world out before us, all feeling there for us to know. This is why language can feel inept and incapable. Human words may provide approximate markers for such feeling, but our strain for precision alerts us to the fact that we are already reaching beyond a species-specific possession and towards something larger than ourselves. The elusiveness of a precise language is evidenced, too, in metaphor's inevitable descent from startling recognition quickly into cliché. For example, to call the otter playful or to say the ocean is mysterious tells us almost nothing now. It moves nothing because we've heard all of this before. But multispecies synesthesia insists that we keep paying attention, scribbling half asleep and late into the night, for human language will rarely get it right, as in right in the gut, so that you feel the fellow feeling in your own flesh. And even then, it will hold for only as long as it can keep the synesthetic relation alive, which is sometimes almost not at all. And this is maybe why poetry is also a suture, seemingly pulling two things together when what hits you in the gut and holds you is actually the bycatch, unasked for and almost accidental. This may also be why humans who have supposed mastery of language find it particularly difficult to catch a fellow feeling and hold it without breaking it. Too much certainty. Using human language badly, wildly, unfaithfully, or errantly may do a better job at feeling something that is always still being translated. Our attempts to hold these complexities in language can be a humble extension of our relation to the world. So both feelings and the words that hold them can come from nowhere else but the world. Feeling is bodies learning from other bodies, and learning feeling is to be in relation. Part 6, learning endings. Or feeling endings, actually. During one of the necropsies, I watch your palm as it rests on the animal's back. You are holding the animal, but the animal's body is also supporting you. Literally, I mean. This is just a material fact. The animal's body supports your hand because the animal is no longer supported by the sea, and succumbing to terrestrial gravity, it is now stranded on your table. I think of Ocean Vuong's father, cradling that pink snout of the dolphin, teeth like bullets, somewhere in Connecticut. We live in a time of almost unfathomable loss, and we are called to respond. We are called to respond to that which we cannot fully understand, and we are called to understand why and how we are called. These are the words that begin an essay by anthropologist and field philosopher Deborah Bird-Rose, written almost a decade ago, called In the Shadow of All This Death. Rose's work was interested in questions of death and extinction and how these phenomena reshape worlds. Debbie died a handful of years ago, too early from cancer. And lately I find myself returning a lot to her work. In these times, there is so much death around us. Pandemic time and extinction time and colonial climate catastrophic time. The difficulty of just getting through the day time, so sometimes you don't. Genocide time. Death presents not only as the death of individual beings, but also as the end of a species, or the end of a way of life, and the end of lifeways. The end of possibilities and the end of relations. And as Deborah Bird-Rose suggested, even though death must be an important part of life, death is sometimes not only death, but double death. In this time, some call the sixth great extinction, which cannot be understood as separate from capitalism and colonialism and militarism and heteropatriarchy and other forms of violence. In this time, not only do individuals die, but their entanglement in other beings' ways of life dies too. And patterns of embodied connection wither and shrink. So we must insist on re-entangling. Things are not looking so great for the sea otter, nor for the underwater forests of giant sea kelp, nor even for the sea. In the Pacific Northwest, these lifeways are threatened by the violences which tether them together, the cascading disasters of colonial expansion and fossil fuel extraction, leading up to contemporary manifestations of climate change, have meant, in the words of geographer Rosemary Claire Collard, quote, a disintegration of social and ecological relations for these kelp, otter, ocean ecologies. As we learn from paying attention to these relations, extinction does not entail a neat excision of a species, but rather the snipping of a knot tasked with complex connecting. Citing extinction studies researcher Tom Van Doren, Collard underscores that this collapse is, quote, a great unraveling of intimately entangled ways of life. Cetacean life is also under threat. Although the ancestors of cetaceans were once land-dwelling mammals, some 4 million years ago, those animals forsook terrestriality for a more watery existence. While some cetaceans made an admirable comeback after the decimation caused by large-scale whaling industries, they are now imperiled anew by noise, hunger, garbage, traffic, and heat. At the frayed edges of the watery habitat that they call home, these stranded animals join many other beings, human and non-human, that in these troubled times have had to take their leave among strangers, removed from their home and kin. These strangers are then called on to respond. Who will care for the stranded? Our cetacean necropsy project tries to honor this question in a community event we hold in West Seattle in September 2022. We walk together through a forest on stolen Duwamish lands, carrying 3 buckets of seawater. In a small clearing, Jessie tells us the story of the Fauntleroy humpback, a juvenile whale that stranded some years ago beside the Fauntleroy ferry terminal, a couple of 100 meters north up the beach from where we sit and listen. We hum together as we descend from the forest and arrive at the open beach. Deborah Bird Rose writes that in living with the dying of others, we bear the burden of witness. But more than that, she writes, the ethical burden is a question of how we inhabit the death zone, how we call out, and how we refuse to abandon others. We have all gathered at the shoreline with the ferry terminal in the near distance. Most of the participants at this event are strangers, but a couple of friends from different parts of my life had come along. I hadn't seen my friend Karen, for example, in about 5 years. She had just lost a beloved family member, a spotted ass named Alias, who she had known since the animal's birth, after which they had walked together across America until they both found their way to a farm in Oregon. I hadn't met Lucretia before. She had heard about the walk through the West Seattle community blog. She was a palliative care nurse and had spent most of the morning walking alongside Karen. When we get to the beach, we place the 3 buckets in front of the driftwood piles, and beside the buckets, we place 3 cloths, 2 cups, a few pieces of kelp, and a piece of purple pimply seaweed called Turkish towel. We kneel beside the buckets, and you pour water over my hands, attending to the skin carefully with the washcloth. And when you're done, Jamie comes to kneel beside me, and I rub the kelp on the skin of her hands and pour water over them with the little blue cup. Someone else comes and Jamie washes their hands. We had no expectations for how this would go. Everyone is mostly silent and attentive. Someone sitting at the back asks if Samantha Lynn could bring one of the buckets closer to them so they could avoid having to navigate the instability of the large pebble beach. And soon all 3 buckets are in use. Patty's child spends a long time looking for something he had placed in his pocket. A clamshell, it turns out, he wants to use to pour the water over Patty's hands as he washes them. Lucretia brings one of the buckets over to where Karen is sitting, off to the side and closer to the water, so that she can wash Karen's hands. I wanted to do this for you, she tells Karen. The Fauntleroy ferry hums as it pulls through the water across the sound. After everyone's hands have been washed, 3 people take the buckets down the beach to repatriate the water to the sea. The walk-shop is called Care for the Stranded. Later, when we gather on the other side of the beach pavilion for lunch, one of the participants, an academic and a theorist, asks me why we chose the word care for our title. It's a pretty overused concept, we both agree. And I've been thinking about this conversation a lot. What does it mean when we give up on words because we've used them up or wrung them out or simply can no longer live up to them? In a time of extinction and colonial climate catastrophe, how are we to feel? Feeling intensifies but also loses certainty. Feeling's temporal container is pulsing and expanding, its membranes now more porous. The past seeps in and the future jumps the gun. How can feeling anything right now not also be steeped in a feeling for what once was and in a feeling for what will or will not remain tomorrow? A singular loss echoes and anticipates others, both known and unknowable. Feeling cannot keep up with the crash of change. All feeling becomes palimpsestic and provisional. This is a different feeling of time, held by the kelp, held by the otter, held by the sea, none of them holding steady. This is a different kind of holding fast, your hand on the back of the animal that has arrived on your table. All of the marine mammal pathologists we talked to over the course of our project stress the importance of staying attuned to the animal as a question of respect. When I hesitatingly asked you once about adopting an objectifying stance towards the dead cetacean on your table, you were taken aback and annoyed. I don't do this for me, you said. Everything that a body accumulates needs to be accounted for. We do this for the animal. This is for the animal and the ones that came before and the ones that come after, you say. Not all of the scientists we interview want to speak about grief or mourning. This is labor, they say. This is work that has to be done. Words are tricky and holding is complicated. And later we spoke about the possibility of untethering objectification from mastery. Language, that supposedly masterful tool of man, must always become more agile, more capacious, but also more resourceful. Words are stretched to their limits, while their labors seem more necessary than ever. What are the words that can adequately hold the unevenly carried grief of these collapsing worlds, of kelp and otters and whales and oceans and so much more? I keep pushing errant syllables around in my mouth, none of them quite catching. Maybe language, like living, also always fails. It seems reasonable to imagine that poetics will not keep apace. It's such hard work. And then what becomes of feeling in the shadow of extinction? Will this feeling made up of relations still circulate through our flesh, lost and looking? We know the story of the phantom limb, the leg below the knee that still aches long after the flesh and bone have been separated from the body. And so I think about our bodies swelling up with phantom feeling, awkward and unsure, a feeling with no body to hold it in relation. A common refrain born of climate crisis concerns nature's indifference towards us humans. Nature will continue naturing regardless of humanity's destiny, so they say, and we will have been but a bleak blip on the layer cake of time. But I wonder if the back of the porpoise will miss the weight of your palm in death, and whether it might also feel a little less held. And I think of all those phantom feelings adrift at sea, and how lonely the ocean would be without all of its relations. Not only the otter and the kelp and the porpoise and the whale, but also by extension, the human communities who care for the stranded. I don't know. What I do know is that the antidote to the violent touch of anthropogenic disaster cannot be an insistence that all touch be withheld. If we learn feeling from being in relation to the world, then no language will save us when those relations dissolve. The words might remain for a while as placeholders, but as relation without relata to anchor it in the world, will some feeling be unlearned altogether? No call, no response. Hold fast. I wonder what feeling will quietly unravel as the world becomes undone. It is late. In the night sky outside the window, I see 2 stars. I turn back towards the computer screen, and I notice how you lay your hand on the only piece of skin still intact on the animal. I think we're ready, you say.